I have so many friends and just people that I'm mentoring who often ask me, how do I figure out my calling? And I tell them, you got to take that 90 minutes at some point in your life and just sit with a pencil and paper in hand and just try to figure out what is it that God has gifted me with, what am I fully passionate about, what am I willing to suffer for, and how can I serve God's purposes by doing that. So I want to encourage you to consider doing that. Here we are, chapter 7, the three main subheadings. We're going to spend most of our time here, okay, on the third one. We're going to try to do a calling statement. We're going to take some time, hopefully, within this hour to write out your calling statements. Some of you guys might already have a personal calling statement, a personal life statement. This might be a chance to refine it. I'm going to give you guys some guidelines that might hopefully help. But as I've often said, especially these first couple of weeks, what we're trying to do is define and discern and deploy calling in as many different ways as possible, because some of it will resonate with you, others will resonate with others of you. It's just such a big topic and it's spiritually discerned that there's no just formulaic, like, here, this is it, I'm done, we can go on. We just approach it in multiple ways, right? Okay, so under number 1, work and worship, I don't need you to spend a ton of time here except to recognize that within the Old Testament and arguably the New Testament, the same word that is used for work is the same word that's used for worship. So they're quite very closely connected. It wasn't by accident perhaps, or maybe it was, but coincident that Derek Carr, right, the NFL quarterback, said that what they call work, I call worship. It's just that closely intertwined from the right perspective, right? That's all I really want you to get for the first one, okay? Pretty straightforward, right? That work is a form of worship. I mean, we all know that the commandment to work was the first commandment ever given by God. And when was it given? Well, start very early on in the scriptures. Genesis chapter 1. Can't get sooner than that. That's great. And God says, let us make man in our image, male and female, let us create, right? And then have dominion over the seas and the birds and all that, right? So that is pre-fall. Work is not a curse, right? Work is given pre-fall. And does that make sense? Before Genesis 3, right? So work is not a curse. Okay, so let's move to the strange word liturgy, which to many of our Pentecostal or evangelical ears, right, Protestant ears, sounds a little strange. Like, why would we be talking about liturgy? That's Catholic and Anglican at best. Why are we talking about it? This quote, it's in your book. At the very least, what we can take from this is that the word liturgy, first of all, was Paul grabbing it from outside of a Christian context, and it was almost like pointing to like monuments or roads dedicated to Greek gods. And Paul said that's what we're doing when we talk about liturgy. Therefore, he says, liturgy is not just what we do on Sunday, like smells and bells, right? We talk about, right? Like, lighting candles and incense, but ringing bells. But actually, liturgy, he says, is when I went to the congregation in Macedonia and asked them for a collection and brought it with me to the church in Jerusalem, who were poorer than the church in Macedonia. That's liturgy. Right? So again, you can see how work and worship are closely connected through this idea of liturgy. Does that make sense? Work being like, let's just do social justice and world vision stuff. Are you guys following when I say that? And let's call that liturgy. Whereas most of us, we go, oh, liturgy and smells and bells. Well, Sunday bleeds over to Monday through Saturday. That's the idea. Okay? Everyone got that? Any questions? Yes, Kayla.
So, could you kind of say like...
That's a good question, yeah. Let me think. I see where you're headed. That's right. Perhaps we can say it this way. One simple way of saying it is that worship is not limited to Sunday. That's obviously one we can say that. But the second one we can say is the very thing that we all think is the most like Sunday type thing you can do, which is like kneel, raise your hands, whatever, right? Is actually originally found in the context outside of the church. Therefore, we should be motivated into thinking that God really meant worship to take place outside of the church, not only within the church. Yeah, and let's think of it this way: what's the point of liturgy? That's a good beginning point, Caleb. But what is the point of liturgy? If you think about it, like what's an example of liturgy? Let's start there, from the reading, or just what you know if you've ever visited a Catholic Mass, or you're part of one, or went to the Anglican Church. What is the point of liturgy? Yeah.
I think it's like to gain perspective.
Okay.
As a form of worship.
Okay, good. Gain perspective in what sense? Like toward what or for what?
For instance, with the Eucharist.
Okay, good. I like that. It's to increase reverence. It's outside of the everyday, and it kind of strikes you as like, oh wait, there's bread and wine here, on a table that's neatly placed. What else is an example of liturgy? That's great. The Eucharist. What else? It's hard for us Protestants to. I'm assuming most of us are. Yeah.
Like the
Josh.
Nicene Creed, like confession of sins.
Okay, the Confession of Sins. Good.
Liturgy,
Okay, the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. Great. What else?
baptism.
Baptism. Excellent. This is great for us Protestants, by the way. We're doing well here. Like when because we don't. But if you, yeah.
Like the liturgical calendar.
Okay, good. That's part of the church's liturgy, the liturgical calendar, Advent, Lent, all that stuff. You guys hear about these things? Okay, good. Yeah. And then, like, what do you see when you walk in on the walls of a church that's like high liturgy? We don't see much nowadays, right? But what? Icons and stained glass windows, and remember all that? I remember hearing about it somewhere in the distant past, right? Well, in England, obviously that's a little bit more around because they're much more they're Anglicans. But do you know what those stained glasses were for? And it's kind of back to your point, but yeah. And what was all that for?
Well, you would light a candle as a
And what does it do to you? I like to put it this way: liturgy is simply, and what you mentioned reverence, but it's more to worship God with. Right? They're physical reminders of spiritual realities. You guys know that stained glass actually tells a story, right? And the closer you get to the front, it goes from the life of Jesus and his disciples to the crucifixion, and then as you come back out, you see the resurrection and then the life of the apostles. Are you guys? The Acts of the Apostles. Are you with me? So it's telling a story. Why? Because before the year 1516, how did you learn the Bible? Auditorily, and maybe pictorially. Right? You've seen it on stained glass, and then you heard it from you didn't read it because it was the Bible, right, before the printing press. So this is a story that's being told. There's more to worship God with. Now, what about today? How come a lot of evangelicals or Pentecostals or charismatics don't use liturgy? Well, actually, maybe we do. Maybe it's in the form of like really cool praise band and particular font selection, and it's different, but it's our day version of liturgy, isn't it? Smoke screen, not smoke screen, what do you call it?
Machine.
Yeah, smoke machines.
Lasers.
We laugh almost at ourselves but isn't it a lot of, some mega church version of liturgy? It's more to worship God with. Now, I'm not here to debate whether smoke machines should be allowed in a sanctuary. They shouldn't. But what I'm trying to say is that keep the function, but even if you change up the form, the function is more to praise God with. Before it was stained glass windows. Today it might be, I actually do believe there's a liturgical point of font selection. Does that make sense? Like, I think God cares about the fonts we use, and you shouldn't just use Calibri because that's the default font on PowerPoint. Right? Some of you guys are, oh shoot, I just used Calibri for student presentation this afternoon. But you get the idea. I just recently been reading through Exodus. And man, if you've read it, right, where every single cubit foot is accounted for, and this particular hue of blue you're supposed to use, that's kind of like if you look on a YouTube video that's really well done, they use a certain kind of blue because it helps the people stand out better and so on and so forth. I'm not saying they drew out from Exodus, but I am saying that the Lord cares about beauty, right? So liturgy, this is the long response to your good question, Kayla, which is, hey, we've got liturgy, which reminds us that God cares about beauty, and where is beauty to be found? Both inside the church and inside culture. And culture is everything that you and I contribute to. It is a film, but it's also a inviting dentist's office, and name the rest, right? So liturgy is a reminder for us Christians to gain perspective to worship, to have more to worship God with, both on Sunday but also Monday through Saturday. Ours is an embodied tradition. So get that language, okay? Embodied, right? We are embodied. As such, a Christian view of the world does not equate importance with invisibility. What's the point? If we held to that view, then we would begin to believe invisible activities like prayer and Bible study and salvation and giving a sermon, those things which are somewhat invisible, like praying and our souls, those are what really count as spiritual. Well, rather, embodiment, physicality, things we can touch like bread and wine, stained glass windows, and the material world are also God created and therefore created as good, right? There's a goodness to embodiment. How do you guys know this theologically or biblically? How do you know this, that embodiment is a good, that physicality is good? How do you guys know that? Anywhere else in Scripture or theologically that you know, that you learn in 101, 201, 301, or 300C? Yeah? It's as simple and profound as that, right? We were made, not God created, created us souls, but He created us in bodies, souls that are in bodies, or embodied souls, or whatever. That's the beginning. Anything else? Great, Josh. What's the end of us, so to speak? What happens after death? Arguably, we're eternally embodied. We have a glorified body. So God seems to like the fact that we're embodied. He created us embodied, right? So if that's true, then here's the point I want to take us to, which is point number 3. How is world change going to happen? How are you and I going to contribute with our calling to making a difference in this world, to building the kingdom of God, to impacting culture? Answer, James Smith from Calvin College, I think, helps us with this. And I got 1 or 2 quotes from him, which I think are really powerful. And I alluded to this already in the past a few weeks. But I love these particular quotes from this book, right? And even without reading the whole book, just these quotes, you can get a sense of what he's saying. So under the title of Our Body Reality, Our Material Spirituality, and World Change and Calling, how does all this relate? Here's what he says. So take a look at his quote. It's pretty powerful. Here's what Smith says. The church often adopts a misguided strategy when it comes to changing ourselves and changing the world. He says, while the Mall, Victoria's Secret, and Jerry Bruckheimer, CSI, or all the big Hollywood blockbusters, right? While they're grabbing hold of our gut, our heart, our cardia, by means of our bodies and its senses, literally, what we take in through, sight, smell, ears, and so forth. That's Jerry Bruckheimer. That's Victoria's Secret. They're grabbing hold of our gut. How? Through stories and images, sights and sounds, what he calls the commercial version of smells and bells. That's what he calls secular liturgy. Are you guys all following the language? I know it's kind of deep language here. But what's he saying? He's saying that while the church tries to do things rationalistically, the way that humans are changing is through our senses. So I gave this example, I think, in another class. But remember when you're walking down the mall, 20 feet before you even get to the store, you smell the particular cologne that's always coming out from that store. You begin to see this big like jumbotron of air, like waves crashing on the beach, and then you even smell you hear the waves crashing, right? You guys know what store I'm talking about?
Yeah.
What? Hollister. Like everyone always knows it, right? Even before you see, like, oh, I think Hollister's around the corner, because you smell it, you hear it, and so what's the point? The point is, the marketers at Hollister understand social psychology and, I would argue, theological anthropology, meaning how are we made as human beings? They understand better of that than even we as the church understand it. Why? Here's the rest of the quote. This is great. He says, while secular liturgies are enticing us with affective images of a good life, the church is trying to convince us otherwise by depositing ideas. Here's how he finishes. Such a rationalist response is inadequate and mistargeted because it continues to assume a flawed anthropology. What is that flawed anthropology? That we are just minds that need more ideas so that we can change and become greater people and then change the world. Are you guys following the logic? So Smith is saying, wait a second, how come secular liturgies, mall, movies, Victoria's Secret, found a way to grab our hearts, get worshipers of Hollister, followers, believers who follow them literally on Instagram, whatever, they get us by our hearts, and then the church is like, here, believe 5 more doctrinally sound things, and then we'll change and become better people. But the war is going on here. It's a war of loves. Remember we said being loved, and so that's why we talk so much about that. And so, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Do you think that's an argument of why, like, laser lights and smoke machines are actually more necessary in churches nowadays?
Arguably more necessary, or it's one of the ways to engage? Is it the most effective way? That's arguable. But at least, yes, the point is they're trying to do something that makes sense to the generation that was like 8.5 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, you get the idea. But that's exactly it. Let's not poo-poo on the form, so to speak, right? Because we understand the function, and at least they're aware that 10 more reasons why you should come to church this Friday isn't going to work in an email massed out to the youth group, but giving them an attractive vision of the good life would. You know, that's why if you brought Derek Carr here to speak, you know, on campus, you would have almost all of the student body attending, versus like Park has something to say. You know what I mean? Like, I'll give you reasons why we should believe in Christianity, but Derek Carr would just stand up and go like, yeah, so check it out. And then like, oh, I don't know, whatever. But you get the idea. Sal, a great question.
Would you say other people?
Yeah, true, yeah. So have we sometimes segmented our churches too much, that youth group is youth group and adults, and that's unhealthy? I agree with that too. So these are great, thoughtful, like, how do we build a healthy ecclesiology, a healthy church life? This is great. I thought what you were going to head was like, well, what do you say of the American church, which actually is not found guilty of Smith's target, which is that we're too rationalistic, meaning isn't the American church, if anything, guilty of not being rational enough, that we're anti-intellectual and we haven't thought through our faith enough, and we do need more robust theology within it? I think that's fair too, right? But I think Smith is still making a good point. If we're going to bring good theology, let's bring it in the form of beauty and it's attractive, right? And let's not compartmentalize, well, over my religious life is truth-oriented, and then my party life is beauty-oriented. I'm going to go party. Like, let's get the beauty and truth to come together. It's a big question, but I think you guys are saying that at the very least. Let me just try to illustrate, and let me just try to finish this thought. And the founder of MTV, if you guys remember this example, said to Oz Guinness, you know, they're good friends, right? But the founder of MTV is not a Christian. But he said to Oz, as friends, like, I'm just telling you this as a friend, you know, you Christians would have won that abortion and pro-life debate a long time ago, is if instead of giving us 10 more reasons why we should be pro-life, right, rationalists, 10 more reasons, you just made 1 or 2 compelling videos to make us see the importance of life, you would have won this a long time ago, right? We are embodied creatures, and the message gets more clear when you present it in a package that works. Does that make sense? So the gospel is the same message, but how do we package it in a beautiful way that's compelling? Not compromise it, but communicate it beautifully, right? So that, and by the way, I don't know if you guys know this, but we probably do, but statistically, you know how generally speaking, right-wing people went a little bit more pro-life, left-leaning people went a little bit more pro-choice, generally speaking, but statistically, among your generation, there's been a huge shift over on the Democratic side of things to being pro-life, and precisely as a result of some of the more grotesque videos, but also some of the more aesthetically well-done videos on the debate. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of Democrats are now actually pro-life, just as an example of what this gentleman was saying. So how does all this relate to calling? We don't have time to do this, but you guys read about it briefly. But the exercise I was going to have us do for like 30 seconds is just, can you think of something, anything whatsoever, and we would realize that all of life can be characterized in 3 things: truth, goodness, and beauty. And I have examples of that. But if you literally take any thought or idea or person or event in anywhere in this universe, theologians have said it can be characterized in one of 3 ways: either truth, goodness, or beauty. So you have something that's half true, fully true, or not true at all. You have things that are beautiful or distorted, good or evil. And these 3 things is a way of doing calling that's Christian. Meaning, Chick-fil-A can just make great chicken burgers and consider themselves contributing to the kingdom of God, even if they never did close on Sundays, or even if they never did put, or In-N-Out put little verses on the bottom of their cups. They're still doing kingdom work, provided that it's lining up with truth, goodness, and beauty, because, as the theologians pointed out later, where does all truth, good, and beauty come from but from God? They are enough to move us a step closer, as it were, to the God of whose kingdom it is. Okay, so now we have a chance to work on our calling statement, to write that out. I know a lot of people might be thinking, well, is that really such a big deal? I actually think it is. I think writing something out really helps us to clearly define what we're about. And so that's what the calling statement is all about. But before we get started, I want to share a couple of last quotes that we've looked at before in the course so far. The first one is from Buechner. Frederick Buechner is a writer who wrote a lot about calling. One of the first things he wrote, a lot of people quote this, is God calls you to the kind of work that A, you need most to do, right? Like you can't not do it. Remember we talked about that? Like what's the thing that you most need to do? And B, that the world needs most to have done, right? And in that place where your deep gladness and the world's deepest hungers meet, that's where he defines calling. Another person we talked about before is William Placker. To believe that a wise and good God is in charge of things implies that there is a fit between the things that need doing, there's the things that the world needs doing, and the person that I'm meant to be. Finding such a fit, I find my calling, right? So there's that notion of fit again. And the third quote again comes from Os Guinness, and he says, to understand ourselves, we need to know not only our gifts, but also our deepest desires or passions that we long to fulfill. Where our giftedness and our deepest desires are intertwined, that's calling. So, and I'll put the slide up again, but secondary calling is that intersection of our gifts, our passions, serving God's purposes. Okay, so with that said, how do we make that into a calling statement? How do we bring that together into literally a half-sentence statement about the core of who we are and what we're made to do? So to do that, I want to just share my calling statement, and then I want to also tell you how I kind of came to know this, and that's actually to bridge the church and the academy with theology, right? So to bridge the church and the academy with theology. There might be various ways I do that, right? Expressions of my calling could be, speaking at a church or teaching here at the university or writing a book and so on and so forth. There's a lot of expressions of our calling, but it's always to bridge what's going on at the university with the hearts and minds of the people at the church. And I do it through theology, right? That's the key. As I showed a picture here, I was driving once with my mentor, and he described my work as the missing middle. He said, man, the things that you're writing about, things that you're passionate about, sounds like the missing middle. And I was like, what do you mean by that? He said, there's a missing middle between the church and the academy. Too many people stay in the church, and too many people stay in the academy, but they don't really intertwine. But you're speaking in a place where you can speak from the fruits of the academy, but also deliver some of that to the church and vice versa. And so that really resonated with me. And so that's why, again, just to point out the importance of mentorship in trying to find our calling. I have so many friends and just people that I'm mentoring who often ask me, how do I figure out my calling? And I tell them, you got to take that 90 minutes at some point in your life and just sit with a pencil and paper in hand and just try to figure out what is it that God has gifted me with, what am I fully passionate about, what am I willing to suffer for, and how can I serve God's purposes by doing that? So I want to encourage you to consider doing that. And so here are some guidelines which we use to talk about writing a calling statement. And And so the first is we begin by praying, right? It's not your calling, it's God's calling on your life. And so we're going to need guidance from God. And so I would encourage you literally take those 90 minutes, hour and a half, somewhere in your schedule as you pray through, read through all the stuff that we've been going through in this course. And maybe around this time in the course, week 7 or 8, you can just set aside a Saturday morning, go to a local coffee shop or wherever you do your best thinking, and you can just clear your mind and begin by praying and say, God, what is it that you designed me for? How can I serve your purposes with the ways that you've made me and the things you've made me passionate about? And so spend some time praying. And then as you continue to pray throughout those 90 minutes, the second thing I would say is don't make it too broad. At the same time, don't make it too narrow, right? Too broad would be like, I want to help people live healthy lives. That's super broad. I mean, I would hope that everyone's calling contributes to living healthy lives in some way, right? So it's just too broad. But you can also get too narrow, right? Like you're very excited about church planning, let's say, I don't know, just as one example, and you specify, I want to plant churches on digital platforms like Facebook. I mean, that's so specific, right? What if God has a calling on your life that involves church planting, but isn't just like specifically digital or Facebook and only Facebook? Because what if Facebook goes away or whatever, right? So you can be too broad and too narrow, and that would be to miss the mark. You want to get somewhere in between where it's broad enough where you can continue doing it for the rest of your life, but also narrow enough where it's only you who can really fulfill that calling. So that's the first kind of set of guidelines. Another thing I would encourage you to think about is to keep it succinct. Right around 5 to 15 words is about ideal. Mine is, let's see, I think it's 10. So right around 5 to 15, because too short, you don't get enough in there. And if it's too broad, it's hard to remember, even for yourself. And so it's not really defining you as clearly and as succinctly as it can. So I would encourage you, find a way to make it in that range of 5 to 15. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. And then that will really make you want to make every single word count as you pray through this and as you write it down. And by the way, there'll be multiple iterations of this, right? You might write it a couple times for the first 30 minutes. You might revise it again the next 30 minutes. Maybe 30 days later, you'll come back to pray over it, and then you'll revise it again. But the key thing is to get writing. And then yes, it'll get revised over time. To be honest, as I've shared this before throughout this course, it's taken me about 10 years to come up with those 10 words for my calling statement. And my encouragement and our work as a staff here, what we hope to do is to be able to bring this to you in a way that maybe in 10 weeks' time or 10 months' time, the Lord can help you crystallize all of this, right? And another piece of advice would be to try to use only one verb. I know this sounds super like legalistic or grammarian type, but really, if you can use just one verb, in my case, to bridge the church and the academy with theology, that one active verb is going to do most of the work, right? And as you can hear from that calling statement, I feel like that does a lot of the work. There's the context of the academy and the church and whatnot, and theology. Those contextualize it a little bit more, but it's that one verb that you want to home in on to find out what it is that you're really doing with your life, right? On the second slide here, on the second side of the slide, you'll see a few more instructions or advice, and that would be to make it precise, right? Again, make those words count. When you say you feel called to the church, let's say, right? Does that mean literally the local church or the universal church where you're just helping Christians? Or is your calling meant for the world to include non-Christians, right? What's the difference between a local church and the kingdom of God? Obviously, those are very, very different. So are you which one fits better to your calling, right? Are you called to the kingdom more broadly or to the local church as a pastor? Or you get the idea. So you might be called to do work as an engineer. You would imagine that would obviously not just be to the church, but to the world. So you have a focus toward the world, but even within the world, is it a kingdom-oriented focus? You get the idea. There's lots of ways. It's just, my point is, make it very precise. Christians, non-Christians, churches, and so forth. And then here's a little trick I like to use, which is consider using a phrase. So suppose your calling is to help people who find themselves vulnerable in some way or other, right? To make every single word count, instead of saying, to love people who are vulnerable in various ways. Maybe you just say to love the vulnerable, and that's part of your calling statement, right? So that's a little trick to kind of save, instead of like 6, 7 words, you can use 2 words, right? Or the broken, or the lost, or whatever, right? So that's a little trick that I think kind of a lot of my students have found helpful. So think through that as using this sort of this adjective that functions as a noun, right? I know this sounds like a grammar lesson, but an adjective like vulnerable or broken that now just functions as the vulnerable, the broken, the lost, right? So that's how you can maybe make it precise as well. Moving on, another piece of advice would be consider using prepositions, right? It does feel like a grammar lesson, but it is a calling statement after all, right? So we want to make this a nice packed sentence or a statement. So use a preposition like with or through. We've found to be very helpful in formulating a calling statement, right? With and through provides a kind of a context for your calling to be done, right? How your calling can be done well. So for example, sometimes using the preposition by is a little bit too broad. It could work, but with and through seem very powerful. So for example, I just happened to write this one myself. It's not mine, but I just thought of someone who might use it, something along the lines of assisting the elderly through spiritual formation and physical care, right? That through does a lot of work because a lot of people are going to be assisting the elderly, right? That's a lot of people's callings, right? But when you specify it through spiritual formation and physical care, that through does a lot of work for that calling statement. So again, assisting the elderly through spiritual formation and physical care, that might be another way of crystallizing your calling statement even further. And another example, again, we looked at this lady early on in week 2, I believe, but Celeste Headley, she says to mobilize and inspire people by or through the power of her voice, right? So there's that through that's working a lot there, right? So that's just another example. There's plenty of examples we can look at, but that's just one other piece of advice. And then the last piece of advice, or 2 more. One is make it about your why, not your what. No one is called to be an electrical engineer for General Motors, right? That's a job. That's your what you do. But remember, the why you do it is the reason for your waking up every day, right? Because remember, calling includes weekends too, and you're not called to General Motors on weekends typically. So what is your why you get up every single day, even when you rest on your 7th day, your Sabbath, you're resting so that eventually you can re-energize in order to do the same thing again, which is your why. So you want to focus on your why, not what job you want in 5 years' time, but why you would get any job or decline any job. That why, when you keep focusing in on that, it'll get clearer and clearer to help you write your calling statement. And then lastly, again, as always, remember your GPS, right? Your gifts and your passions. Passions, what you enjoy doing, with some suffering for sure, but it's what you enjoy doing. And then your gifts are what others enjoy your doing. They just love it when you are doing your calling. And so remember your passions and your gifts, and then what's out there in the world that God is working at right now that I can line those up with so that my GPS is whole and complete and it's precise, right? So that's my encouragement to you. I actually am praying for you as we film this here and as you get a chance to sit down and write this out. As often we say around here, can you imagine a world in which everyone fulfills their why, really seeks it out and puts it to use to God's kingdom and God's glory? Man, what a different world this would be. And so that's my encouragement. And we do have one last slide here, which I'll put up on the video, and that is looking at your occupational aspect of your calling. So specifically, let's just talk about your job. In that specific area, there are this little graph to figure out, okay, where do I want to spend most of my time? In the church, in the world? And if it's in the church, where in the church world? And then if it's in the world, where in the world? And we'll have that up here for you to gaze at. Maybe you can pause and glance over it and ponder and pray over it as you go ahead and write your calling statement. So hopefully these couple of slides and these couple of minutes will be helpful for you. We really pray that it would, and we're praying this because we're hoping that God's glory gets enhanced by the work that you do and the work that we're all called to do. So that's it for the calling statement.